I would love for you to subscribe because this channel is all about creativity and inspiration. I hope you feel inspired to create something amazing. Feel free to share the inspiration because life is a journey we make together. And now I'll show you how this quilt was done. Now what I've decided to do, because this quilt is so tattered and so torn, that I'm going to have to remove this outside edge, this outside border. That's the only thing that I can do to save the rest of the quilt, which I think I've got in pretty good shape. Now for the binding, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut strips in 2.5 inches, open it up and press it again on the inside, just like that. And this way it gives me crease lines to follow. So I'm hand sewing the binding on because this whole quilt is handmade. And I didn't want to put a machine to it. So I'm sewing each piece of binding by hand. And it's the same way that you would do it with a machine. I'm going to take off the salvage. I'm going to hand sew a seam right across here on the diagonal. Now when I open this, my binding just is continued. I'm going to cut this off. How I do the corners is I'm going to come right down here with my stem stitch, sew my binding on, and do a 45-degree right to the point of my quilt. Lay the binding back over itself, fold it over just like you would be doing on your sewing machine, except this is just all by hand. Lays right on top. I'm going to put a pin right there. When you've pressed your binding, it really comes in handy. You can see that I'm going to follow just on that line right there. Line it up with my quilt right along that edge. Now I'm finishing up on my binding that I'm hand sewing on the inside first, so then when I remove this border I can just wrap it around. But what I have to do now is join these two pieces together. So how you do this, I'm going to measure the width of my binding. I've marked my fabric so I know exactly where the bottom binding is. Now I'm going to measure from that mark over exactly the width of my binding. So my binding is 2.5 inches. I'm measuring 2.5 inches from the binding on the inside, and that's where I'm going to cut. Now, the bottom one goes up, this one goes down, and I'm going to pin it right here. I'm going to mark my binding. So my two pieces have been joined, and now I can continue. What I've decided to do is take off the tattered
the torn, the worn outside border. I just couldn't repair it. It was just too bad. And in order to salvage the rest of the quilts, I'm having to just remove it. And what I do actually is I'm slipping this, what it is an ironing board and cutting board on one side, but it's just flat. Make sure that I don't cut anything behind that I don't want to cut. I've sewn the binding by hand, since this is a hand done quilt. Then what I'm doing is just wrapping the binding around. It's working out very well. Kind of transfer this flat piece on the back so I don't sew anything that I don't want to. How many times I've sewn my clothes to what I'm working on. So I always work on a board. It just seems to work well for me. I love these wonder clips for binding. I usually use like 3, but in this case I'm using 4. Just to hold the binding in place. I'm using silk thread, which I absolutely love, by YLI. It matches the back perfectly, and you can't even see the stitches. Awesome. Now, when I do any kind of binding work on any type of quilt, what I like to do is I like to set it up on like a TV tray so that the bulk of the weight isn't on my lap. I can kind of manipulate it around, and I find it a lot easier to work on my binding. So I'm just finishing up the binding on the quilt that I'm restoring. Wanted to point out a couple of different things. These tailor thimbles are really great to work with. They come in different sizes, different shapes, but you can use them on your thumb. And what I like to do is use them to push my needle, and I also can grab the needle easier. So I have noticed over time that I really do like using these, especially with the binding. Now when you're doing the binding, so all you want to do is take a small stitch on your quilt, not going all the way through, and just come up right on the side of your binding and come all the way up. Another little bite, and then on the edge as much as possible. And I do this probably an inch. And then I just go through my loop just to kind of secure it and continue on. Now this quilt was all hand done, so any modifications that I have done to this quilt are been all by hand. And don't forget to put a label on your quilt. It's really great if you have a picture, any information that you know about the person that made the quilt. It just makes it extra special.